about black everything.
Welcome to Left in Black. My name is Sasha Panaram. I'm a graduate student in the English department, and today we're joined in the studio with artist, curator, activist, and Afrofuturist Ingrid LaFleur. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sasha.
I want to start our discussion today by talking a little bit about what brings you to Duke and Durham. So you're participating as part of the Water series for the Franklin Humanities Institute, and it's a year-long series that's thinking about both aesthetic or artistic and humanist responses to water, everything from oceanic voyages to refugee migration, thinking about how people build entire lives around water. And you're going to be giving a talk later today entitled From the Drexia to Mars, an Interplanetary Water Mission. And you're also going to be participating on the Oral Futures Film Festival, or film series rather. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about, for our viewers who may not be familiar with Afrofuturism, could you give us a broad view of how you understand that term and also how you came to call yourself an Afrofuturist? What was your introduction into that concept?
Yes, you know, that actually took a little bit of time for me to call myself an Afrofuturist. Me and labels, it takes a minute. But I found it to be a little important because Afrofuturism is this wonderful way of kind of gathering a very particular type of cultural production and bringing together a particular like-minded community. So by labeling myself Afrofuturist, then I can connect in a deeper way with a larger group of people. So Afrofuturism is a way of discussing the Black experience using speculative modalities like science fiction, fantasy, magical realism, horror. Afrofuturists look at African and African diasporic spiritual practices, mythologies and legends, and we also look at the intersection of science and race and technology. All of that is really to look at ways for Black liberation by determining and controlling our destinies. But in order to do that, we have to really make sure that in the imaginary, in our imagination, that we have new narratives, decolonized narratives, and that we uncover these kinds of what I call invisible histories that aren't usually taught to us that can really inform our present and help sculpt the future.
Right. And you've talked about yourself and described yourself as a community organizer. And so when I hear you use the language of decolonizing the mind, I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about your project Afrotopia and sort of what are the different ways that one would go about decolonizing the mind? What are the different projects?
Yeah, decolonization is a process. I think it's ever evolving. I don't think you ever stop simply because we're living in the colony. Right. So we're always in this kind of almost opposition mode, unfortunately. But Afrotopia came about when I moved back home to Detroit about 8 years ago. Okay. And I saw that white men were really determining Detroit's future, and they are still, because they have the capital to do so. Detroit is 85% Black. We are majority of color. So it's very strange to have a white men determining our futures, and as we all know, that never goes well. So I really wanted to create something where we are starting to envision people of color, especially Black bodies, in these futures in Detroit. And I thought Afrofuturism would be a good mechanism. Now, prior to moving back home, Afrofuturism was a hobby for me. So I didn't really understand how to implement Afrofuturism. I understood it as this cultural movement, as an aesthetic. But I didn't really understand how to use it as a mechanism for liberation. So I experimented. I taught youth Afrofuturism, adults Afrofuturism. I had a book club for a long time where we would read Afrofuturist literature. I curated Afrofuturist film series at the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Charles Wright Museum. And all of these moments, I would start hearing from people that, one, They are already Afrofuturists, and they didn't realize they were.
Right.
And two, they really appreciate being able to connect with the African diaspora through a different type of portal. And this is like a global kind of connection, right? And Detroit tends to be a little more insular. At the time, museums weren't really bringing certain exhibitions. They weren't bringing a lot of the cultural production that I thought for 85% Black cities should always be present. And so now that's starting to change. There's a real concerted effort on the larger institutions to do that. But at the time, there really wasn't much. And also at the time, Detroit was facing, and we still are, but it was super aggressive kind of takeover. The emergency manager took over right after I came back home. And that is someone who is not elected by the people who's making decisions that have and still are affecting the residents of Detroit in really harmful ways, actually, and I will be talking about that later today. So Afrotopia was my way of really experimenting with giving people other options and kind of other ways of being, redefining Blackness in a way that I'm hoping is empowering so that we can really not control our communities, but really contribute in a deep way in our communities. And that is what's really happening is the hyper-local movements in Detroit. That's what's keeping it going. That's what's so amazing and exciting.
That's great, especially this point about people were Afrofuturists without necessarily calling themselves that. And when I think about the term, much to your point about it being a label, there's a way that, in as much as it gestures to this anticipated temporality, this thing that's in advance of us, so much of that is happening in Black socialities that are unfolding every day. And so it's interesting that you created this space that both calls attention to what's already happening on the ground, and then also at the same time sort of pulling people together such that they can think about collaboration together. They can think about those modes of being collectively in the world that they can then, perhaps they're using different forms, different technologies, different tools to manipulate that or to put that in the world in their own ways. But now you've brought them together in this really unique place.
Right. So now Afrotopia has kind of shifted. I am now working in blockchain technology and cryptocurrency, and I'm looking at creating alternative economies.
Okay.
So what ended up happening as an art curator, I didn't feel like I was affecting the change that I wanted to see enough. In a deeper way. I enjoy definitely shifting imaginations, but I wanted to see something in the physical. And one thing about Afrofuturism that people might not know about is that time becomes nonlinear in that space. So it's not necessarily about creating something for us to kind of in the far future. The future is in the now. And so with that in mind, I'm really, really focused on creating mechanisms for liberation in the now. And I really believe that through economics and the shift of values within economies, then we can really see deep, deep changes, because really it's the economy that is causing the deepest traumas and is preventing us from really attaining that liberation, that prosperity and growth that we want to see in our communities.
Can you talk a little bit more about blockchain technology?
Sure.
That's quite new to me, and so I imagine it might be new to our viewers as well.
Sure.
So I'm curious about sort of how that became the thing that this evolved into, or your most current interest.
Yeah, right. So when I ran for mayor of Detroit last year, I proposed a universal basic income that Detroit would create using a cryptocurrency, and that just the crypto world, the UBI world just kind of descended upon me, which was really great, and I ended up learning more, and I took this whole past year learning more about blockchain technology and cryptocurrency, and now I'm the Chief Community Officer for EOS Detroit, and EOS Detroit is a startup based in Detroit, and we work with grassroots organizations to look for blockchain solutions to really make whatever their efforts more efficient and effective. And so blockchain technology is the technology behind cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency, the most well-known digital currency that everyone loves to talk about is Bitcoin, of course, and that was established in 2009. Since then, many different types of cryptocurrencies as well as blockchains have been created. And a blockchain is literally a digital ledger. It is immutable and it's transparent. And so those two things are really interesting. It's secure because it's immutable. And because it's transparent, and anyone has access to that information, there could be really wonderful, empowering ways to use it in terms of, like, in government, for instance. Certain levels of transparency could be very empowering for citizens. So blockchain technology is actually where the innovation lies. It's where the excitement is. There's many, many more uses for it other than creating or having a token built on a blockchain. You can have contracts that are automated, and you can create decentralized autonomous communities on a blockchain, where communities can create their own token and really decide how it can be used to benefit their people.
That's wonderful to hear, especially it exists both in the community but outside of it, and such that there's a different type of engagement that allows for a more equitable, imaginatory, and then actualized world. And so it's fantastic to hear you speak to that. I'd like you to talk a little bit about sort of the decision back in 2017 to enter the mayoral race. And so both the decision and then sort of what's the most important thing that you walked out of that process learning, or what most surprised you?
Yeah, so it definitely was the most challenging position as a candidate that I've ever had. It's one thing to have opinions about our city, state, government, federal government. We all have those conversations around dinner tables, right? But it's another to, in 1 to 2 minutes, explain it to people and then have questions fired back.
Right.
But what really motivated me was when I was teaching Afrofuturism, I wanted to learn more about education because I wanted to create curriculums in a pedagogy, actually, Afrofuturist pedagogy. And I decided to substitute teach, got in the classroom, and my entire world shifted and changed. That's when I really understood what Detroit was facing in these deep, deep challenges. So before, water shutoffs have been going on for a while in Detroit, but it wasn't as public at that time. So I started learning about water shutoffs by teaching children who were living without water. There is actually a long list of things that you find in a classroom, and many teachers know and understand some of the psychological and emotional stress that children are undergoing and exhibiting. So you end up being a social worker, a mom, and a friend, and all of these other things before a teacher. I just couldn't, once you come in contact with these issues and you see it in children, the responsibility is heavy, and you can't just walk away. There's nothing. I always get emotional thinking about it, because people are quick to say, just pay the water bill. But if a person can't afford to pay the water bill, should a child still have to deal with living without water and the stress that he sees their parents go through to try and provide this one basic resource that our city government is shutting off on them, right? So as an impatient person, I first decided to take some time to go into the social justice community and really ask the questions about, okay, I know that you guys are working on this. What are you proposing? You know, what has government said? Why aren't they responding? Why aren't they stopping this? You know, asking the questions. And I think that that is always important for anybody who wants to, like, kind of champion a cause. You got to go and ask what's already happening and how can I help? And so I thought that running for mayor, one, I am not a politician, so this is not a power grab. this is not about me becoming mayor. It's not an ego-led venture. It was really about making sure that people understood all of their options to resolving these issues. And I was willing to take the risk to discuss universal basic income when other politicians are not, because they don't think that that's going to get them the votes. But for me, it's really about making sure that we're creating like solutions that get to the root of the matter, and that hopefully are sustainable. And so that's why I ran. You know, people thought it was a performance. It was not. It cannot be when you know that so many lives are being affected by this. It's a very serious endeavor. And through that process is when I began really looking at these kinds of like blockchain technology and cryptocurrency. And I did that through creating co-creation sessions in my campaign office. I invited Detroiters to come. We sat in a circle. I presented the issue, everything from adult literacy to tax foreclosures on occupied homes to growing the creative economy, even cryptocurrency. And I would present the issue, some ideas around it, and then we would talk. Like one big family around a dinner table, and I was able to create a plan of action. And coming to the conclusion that the system, the economic and government system in which we're residing in, was never meant to serve the Black body. It was never meant to create any sort of safety or prosperity for the Black body. The Black body is literally an object to be bought and sold in the system. So then why for an 85% Black city are we still using these same methods? And I question that. And in that questioning, it led me into this path. And what I really love right now is that I'm actually still working on everything that I proposed as a candidate. I'm still doing the work. I'm just not doing it as mayor, which gives me a lot more freedom and flexibility. I don't have to compromise any ethics or values.
That's wonderful to hear. And it's interesting to hear you talk about it, especially in this moment when so many more, increasingly we're seeing women of color run for elected office, and sort of thinking about the afterlives of that, whether or not one is elected into office. What can this look like in the aftermath? And you're speaking, especially talking, like hearing you talk about Afrotopia and then the blockchain technology, it has an afterlife of its own, and certainly one that you're following and you're willing to follow and let lead you where it takes you. You've mentioned family now twice, and you've talked about it in terms of dinner tables, being around. I'm wondering about your own family. So you grew up, you were born and raised in Detroit. You did your schooling away, you traveled extensively from what I understand, and then you returned, as you said, back to Detroit. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up and how your family influenced the artistic and creative decisions that you have and that you pursue now. And then also, what is it like to return to Detroit after having been away for a number of years?
Yes. Oh, man. Whew, that's so much. Okay. I'm born and raised Detroiter. I went to public schools in Detroit. And at that time, Detroit was 99.9% Black. It was wonderfully Black. We call it a golden era. It was not perfect, but it was wonderfully Black. And I say that meaning, as a child, I got to see Black people in all types of positions, everything. And so that really kind of shapes your world. And it kind of explains a lot of the cultural production that comes out of Detroit that we're so known for. My dad was a dentist and read both Detroit News and Detroit Free Press every single day. Super political and in his opinions. But he was also an art collector. And so I grew up living in museums and galleries and going to see independent films with my father and really understanding and learning the politics from him. One thing for sure, growing up upper middle class, he always said that I had this responsibility because of that small bit of privilege to give it back. And so that was just totally ingrained since the minute I was born. My mother, she's now in Detroit, And she was a foreign language professor, which meant that when she was getting her doctorate, she was traveling around the world to learn different languages. And this is where I get my love for travel. And just really absorbing and experiencing different cultures. And so the combination of the two is basically created who I am. I'm addicted to travel. I love the arts, and I'm always fighting for the people. Detroit was definitely this beautiful foundation of really solidifying my identity before I even left at a young age. I went to Spelman College afterwards, and then NYU for grad school, and got lost in the sauce of the contemporary art world, which was booming at the time because hedge fund managers were spending all this money, and so it was super exciting for sure, and it was expanding globally. And all of those moments and experiences were really fascinating for sure, but what I saw was that people of color especially were not necessarily present, and I came to understand that Black people weren't collecting art. And it's because the art world is quite intimidating, and so I really wanted to be more of a conduit between the audience and the artists. And so I curated and I started dealing. So when I came back home, I thought that I could still be an art dealer. But when people aren't really comfortable spending $400 on a piece of artwork, and you're coming from New York where people are spending 10 grand, you realize that maybe this may not be the most wisest thing to do here. And so I took a full year of not traveling. Again, I'm addicted to travel, so that was a big deal for me. And I just tried to reacquaint myself with the city, and that was hard. It was very hard. When I was growing up, my grandmother's neighborhood was solidly blue-collar neighborhood with flower pots and porches and kids running around. And now her home, I mean, she wasn't occupying it, we sold it by then, but that home caught fire earlier this year. The one next to it is burnt down. Across the street, 3 are burnt down. There's some vacant lots. I mean, it goes on and on and on. We didn't live that way. So for everyone who returns back home to Detroit, we're just in shock. And it takes a long time for the shock to wear off. And you're almost paralyzed by it because it's overwhelming. And you don't really, because I had been gone for so long, I spent majority of the time in New York. Coming back home, I didn't really understand. I mean, you hear certain things when you're visiting for the holidays, but you don't really understand the full depth of the issue and how it's a coordinated effort. You don't realize that. You know, people just think, oh, the recession hit and they lost their homes. No, city and county government is literally taking homes from people, and then not being able to sell them, sit abandoned. And then they become these dangerous spaces for our children to walk past every day when they go to school. And that's just one slice of issue. We have school closing issues. We have lead in the water in schools. We have, you know, it goes on and on and on. So, you know, it really does take a moment. There were quite a few of us who went back home at the exact same time that I did. And we would sit and we were like, oh my God, what's going on? And what do we do? And how do we move? And we need a hug. And like it's a lot, you know, emotionally. But once you adjust, you get to work. And that's what basically happened.
That's great. What's next for you?
Well, I am happily working on creating a decentralized autonomous community in Detroit. We are creating this decentralized app that will support an initiative to provide internet for Detroiters. 40% of Detroiters right now do not have access to internet. And it's because the internet companies are looking at the credit scores of the area. And so, of course, that's going to be very low when you have recession issues still haunting us. But then also, we're facing a 64% poverty rate when you add the working poor. So that means that they will either not have access to internet at all, or they'll have access at a very, very low speed and and high cost. So the Equitable Internet Initiative was created, and they create a mesh network in 3 different neighborhoods, the lower income neighborhoods. And basically a mesh network is putting a satellite on a house, and then maybe like a couple houses over, you put another satellite, the signal bounces, and then people in that area are able to have Wi-Fi. So they've done like 50 homes in North End neighborhood alone. And it's a really great initiative, and so EOS Detroit is supporting that initiative and basically creating a token so that people can pay for their internet and provide this service, and so hopefully incentivize more people to participate in the mesh network so that we can have access to internet. And so 2 things with this, which is really exciting, is that we get to hopefully create this alternative economy that is more equitable, as you mentioned, and then also increase digital literacy. So one of the issues is that if you teach children coding in a school, well, when they go home, they can't practice. And so that is the thing. We really want to increase digital literacy. People of color have been marginalized within the tech sector and the financial sector. So we really are focused on making sure that Detroiters are not left behind, and hopefully are not just digitally literate, but also innovating within the digital sphere and creating tools that really help their communities.
That's great. We've been joined today on Left of Black with artist, curator, activist, and Afro-futurist Ingrid LaFleur. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Sasha.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.